This set of videos is dedicated to the memory of our friend Rodney Burstow, seen here with a Class 71, former driver and advocate of the Hornby's CC1, 2 and 3, or the booster locomotives. Welcome back. Setting aside the niggles on the model, we'll now take a look at her running and working on the railway. To begin with, CC1 is required to collect some milk tank wagons from the yard. However, last time they tried this, she ran out of booster power because of a signal delay. Now there is a short section of overhead wire to allow CC1 to keep everything running while she shunts and waits to leave. The angry foreman has even come for a look. The cabinet on the platform is used to switch on and off the overhead wire. The Brighton line was electrified with third rail DC power in 1933, initially at 660 volts. The Southern Railways Board had agreed a 10-year agreement with the English Electric Company in 1935, and it was further agreed that this would be renewed for the next 30 years, well into our days. Initially in 1935, the plan had been for a Bobo electric locomotive able to draw power from the third rail supply as well as overhead supply. Not only that, but Alfred Raworth, the Southern's electrical engineer, had specified that the locomotive should be able to maintain traction power when passing through gaps in the third rail, such as found at junctions and stations. After the building of the locomotive had been authorised in 1936, the Southern set about brake trials between Norwood and Three Bridges. The purpose was to find out the maximum loads that could be handled safely. The first involved a Billington K-class steam locomotive number 2352, hauling 82 wagons with a 25-ton brake van at the rear on a downward grade. The locomotive made a full air brake application, locomotive only that is, and the train came to a stand 1.93 miles later. On the 8th of November 1936 more trials were conducted, this time using the motor driving coach of 6 Paul EMU 2004, hauling 30 wagons. Of course it could not get the train running on its own, so a K-class assisted at the rear. Once moving, the power position on the Paul controller were tested, as were the number of encountered gaps in the third rail supply. What an interesting modelling opportunity. Development continued, and by late 1937 the method of maintaining traction power in gaps were 2 motor generator and flywheel sets. Oliver Bullock came forward and suggested that the Bobo wheel arrangement should be replaced with a Coco. The loco would now weigh 100 tons, but the load would be spread over the extra wheels. Raworth agreed, and so it came to pass, and by 1939 detailed designs for 2 locomotives were in place. 1941 and CC1 was built and became part of the Southern's fleet in June that year, despite the ongoing war. Testing proved very positive, with the loco being used on the Portsmouth route on passenger trains. Initially in November it was used on freight trains between Norwood and Chelsea yards. The steam timing for this trip had been 2 hours and 52 minutes, but CC1 did the trip in just 2 hours and 2 minutes. The Southern Railway had planned to operate the locomotive with just a single man in the cab. Understandably, ASLEF, the train drivers' union, had serious misgivings about the plan. A single band where there had always been two, driver and fireman, they felt safety would be compromised, especially given the long loose coupled freight trains that were being operated every day. A meeting was called on the 8th of January 1941, but there would be no agreement until 1957, when the company finally relented and agreed to having two-man operation on loose coupled freight trains. Many changes were required to the Southern Railway infrastructure, including extending the third rails all the way to buffer stops. At the same time, overhead cables were erected at Lovers Walk, Brighton and Bolton. In early 1942, CC1 was at work between Waterloo and Portsmouth Harbour with 12-coach trains. The timings were the same as for the 4 core EMUs, and CC1 actually shaved minutes off the 1 hour 48 minutes allowance. Keep in mind that passenger trains were restricted to 60 miles per hour at this time. CC1 was based at Wimbledon during this period. The grey livery was replaced by malachite green in 1942, as seen on my model. After the war came to an end, CC1 was being rostered work within the timetables with a clear EL annotation being added. She would work a 24-hour period from 01:30 AM to 23:23 PM, starting and finishing at Chichester. No luxury this time with an overhead wire to keep the booster running. CC1 must go into the siding and pick up this southern CCT and draw it straight out and back onto the juice rail, otherwise she'll be stranded. She has around 10 minutes to do this. By 1945, CC2 was taking shape, and while very similar to CC1, there were some improvements, such as driving controls fitted on both sides of the cab, much like the latter-day Class 33 and 73. Late in 1948, and CC3 was in traffic. However, it carried the number 20,003 from the very start. The history of these three pioneering locomotives is long and winding, and I dare say I could present you with far more than I have done, but for the sake of time, let's end this section with the words from some of the men who have worked on them. Biff Manville. I worked on these. I was a fireman at Horsham, and we had a Hornby link. They were very quiet and had 2 boosters on them, which really didn't make much noise. They also had really good brake on them. They were great to work on. I was in the Hornby link, as I said, until Horsham Shed closed in June 1964. Only Stewart's Lane, Newhaven and Horsham had Hornby work. When Horsham and Newhaven shut, Brighton, Three Bridges and Stewart's Lane worked on them. Our work on them was mainly Chichester to Three Bridges or Norwood goods, or on boat trains from Victoria to Newhaven. They were also used on the boat trains as they had steam heating boilers on them. The Hornby link at Horsham had steam work as well as working on these locos. The brakes on the Hornbys were very good. Some of the Horsham drivers did not use the vacuum brake at all and just used the engine brake, with even 60 wagons on. I had the pleasure of working with some of these drivers. One, who passed away last year, was Rodney Burstow. Great times. Spike Jones. The boosters on these locos would allow you to go off the juice for 10 minutes, but only where there was a ramp on the live rail. And Chichester had quite a few ramps, but not behind the signal box, where we shoved back in there one night with a massive coal train. Luckily we had started the booster before entering the yard, but we were still off the juice. When we unhooked and pulled, we realised that there was no ramp, so we had to paddle up That's the process of lifting the pickup shoes up, clear of the track. Not quite like a juice train. The springs on the shoes were a job for Tarzan, and then you had to insert aluminium wedges from the engine room into the beam to keep the shoes up. You had to be quick. The 10 minutes was ticking away swiftly. Also, in the dark, one night a driver reached out for the booster button going through Norwood and put the pantograph up instead. It struck Tennyson Road Bridge. Now Rodney Burstow himself. The Hornbys, all three, were a delight to work on. I had a lot of work on them, both as second man and driver. The Hornbys, you could press the second man into the back of the seat going into a weak field, accelerating out of a gap. Real little toys. I only worked a passenger train with one a couple of times on excursions. Balcombe sidings had some overhead wires, but purely for testing and training for the pantograph working. Also, Bricklayers Arms had a small section to enable pickup from the sidings. I used to race the pantograph going round Arundel Junction just to see the signalman's reaction. I'm not sure whether they went down the eastern side. I think they did go to Hibber Green for testing for some time. They were allocated to Horsham because nobody else wanted to work on them when they first came out. Three Bridges, Norwood and even Brighton turned them down. You were right about the Newhaven boat train. Newhaven men worked these duties, but in the late 50s and early 60s Horsham men had some boat trains as well. Horsham men had boat trains, and we also worked the Galley Hill coal train from Polegate. Brian Denton. I worked with a lot of blokes who had experience of the Hornbys, and everyone without exception liked them. Robert Leavold. Some of my Fratton colleagues, sadly passed away, told me that for a while they worked the Brighton to Exeter as far as Pompey Town, where a steam loco took over. Also a goods from Horsham to Fratton Yard, number 1 Reception Road, which was juiced. Don't know how long this practice lasted. So what's all this about boosters then? Imagine two of our electric motors from our model trains, joined at the shafts with a massive flywheel. Put power into one of the motors, line volts on the locomotive booster motor, and it will spin up the flywheel and the other motor. Take your feed to the traction motors from the other motor, or booster generator. Then if feed current is lost briefly, the flywheel will keep the motors turning and the output steady. Check out this very crude demonstration. A little switch cuts the power to the motor, but the flywheel, which should be a heck of a lot bigger, keeps the output going on the motor generator. That very simply indeed describes how the booster sets kept the locomotives going when encountering gaps in the third rail supply. In reality, there were 2 booster sets in these locos, each feeding 3 traction motors within each bogie. Each flywheel weighed 2,000 pounds or 1 ton. The traction motors were rated at 245 horsepower at 400 volts, however, were connected in series with each other, thus they only saw their full maximum voltage when the booster and third rail supply were being combined in notch 26, giving 1,200 volts of power to be available to the motors. Our locomotive had very fine control, divided up into so-called notches, electromechanical settings. There were 26 notches, and this was a key part of the loco's success. In fact, there were 52 power steps controlled by onboard systems based on the driver's power handle notch position.